Lusitania has quite a large foundation in the maritime community, and, much like other ships of the same status, there are a set of conspiracy theories that have been developed over the years since the ship has sunk. Today, we are going to look at two conspiracy theories that relate to Lusitania, though one of these two can be broken down into two separate categories, and that is because these two in specific relate back to the wreck. Both of these theories were outlined in Dr. Robert Ballard's 1995 publication Exploring the Lusitania, which is a book that he had written after he had conducted his 1993 expedition on the wreck, and he provides information and images of his experience on the wreckage. I will state now that Dr. Ballard did not create these conspiracies, though he does end up adding information to one of them. These conspiracies were already in circulation well before his expedition to the wreck. With that having been said, let us go to the first conspiracy, which is the British government depth charging, or in simplistic terms, bombing the wreck. Now, Dr. Ballard remains rather neutral on this conspiracy, and he only mentions it at the very end during a timeline setup for Lusitania from keel laying to his book's publication, so this means I had to go outside of his book to gather details on this conspiracy. To no one's surprise, this is where the conspiracy actually starts to fall apart, since there is no consistency between any of the stories that you can find online. It is narrowed down to 2 decades, the 1940s and 1950s, and the two most common reasons that I see popping up are during World War II, Lusitania's wreck kept interfering with sonar when hunting U-boats, and so the British government decided to bomb the wreck to flatten it out so that it would be taken off the sonar, though that's not how sonar works. And the other conspiracy is, in the 1950s, the British government was worried that people were going to find out that Lusitania was in fact carrying ammunitions, and so they bombed the wreck to destroy the evidence. However, seeing that they failed to destroy the evidence, this also doesn't make sense. But one thing does remain rather common between these stories, and it's the fact that the British used what is known as the Hedgehog depth charge. The reason that this is the weapon that's been specified is because on an expedition it was claimed that an item was recovered, thought to have been a bottle of some kind of liquid. However, once it broke the surface, the expedition team realized that it was not a bottle but rather an explosive. The problems with this story is, no one knows what expedition did this, what happened to the depth charge, there are no images of this, and the Hedgehog is significantly larger than any bottle of liquid this ship would have been carrying, so before it was even recovered, it should have been noticed that it was not a glass bottle of champagne. But I'm sure some of you are aware that a few articles claim that other hedgehogs were found on the wreck, and there are 2 articles in specific that provide the exact same image of what is claimed to be a hedgehog depth charge on Lusitania's wreck. However, there are some significant issues with this image. Now, this is the image that is claimed to be a hedgehog depth charge on Lusitania's wreck. Now, first things first, it's quite obvious that this item is not the exact same as a hedgehog. There are significant features of the depth charge that are not present on whatever this item is, and if you look closely enough, whatever this item is, it's actually residing under another object, meaning that it hit the ocean floor first. So if this is in fact Lusitania's wreck, whatever this item is went to the bottom of the ocean with the ship, and since the Hedgehog didn't enter production until 1942, it can't be that. I've also seen it proposed that that photograph is miscaptioned, meaning that it is in fact some kind of weapon on a shipwreck, but it's not Lusitania's and nor is it the Hedgehog depth charge. However, I'll avoid adding to that since it's not exactly confirmed as to what this photo even is. The next big killer with the Hedgehog is the fact that the Hedgehog is very ill-suited for a blasting operation like this. You see, the Hedgehog was designed specifically to hunt U-boats at shallow depths, and in order to do so, it was fired in groups of 24, and they formed a circle around the U-boat, and as the U-boat's moving forward or backwards, ideally one of these would have to hit the sub since they're contact detonators, and that would explode. This weapon is noted to be significantly less effective the deeper it has to go, and at Lusitania's depth, it is wildly inaccurate. The longer the circle of hedgehogs is in the water, the greater the chances of them drifting apart and breaking the circle, meaning that almost none of them would have a chance of actually hitting the wreck, let alone causing the significant amount of collapsing that we are used to today. Now that I've gone over the weapon that's been proposed, let's take a look at the 2 reasons that have been given so that we can break these down as well. In the early 1960s, John Light carried out an expedition to Lusitania's wreck, and in so he documented the condition of the ship, and the ship was in resounding condition. Now, as proposed for the sonar theory, the idea is to flatten Lusitania's wreck out so it's no longer being picked up on British sonar. However, according to John Light's expedition, which there are images and footage taken during this expedition, Lusitania's wreck was not flattened out at all. The ship was almost in pristine condition. If the ship was really being a humongous problem on sonar, the British would have had to make sure that the ship was indeed flattened out so that its readings would be lesser. So unfortunately for those who believe in the conspiracy, John Light's expedition that takes place 2 decades after the bombing is proposed disproves it immediately. Okay, so what about the malice intention to hide the fact that the ship was carrying ammunitions? Well, the British government was well aware as to where the ammunitions were being stored on the ship, and that was in cargo hold 2, since this was also the convertible magazine, making it the safest spot for the ammunition to be stored. Conveniently, the bow of the ship is the most intact component of the wreck, since it's been largely undisturbed, and cargo hold 2 itself has only suffered from natural flattening over the century of laying on the ocean floor, rather than explosives. Much like with the sonar proposal, if the British government was going to dedicate themselves into destroying the wreck, you would at least think that they would do this rather than miss and then give up. A more logical and effective solution for covering up the fact that the ship was carrying ammunitions would to simply send dive teams down and begin salvaging the ammunition. However, of course, this never happens. As a matter of fact, the British government releases Lusitania's manifest, and they don't even bother covering up the fact that the ship was carrying ammunitions. So I'm sure some of you must be asking this question: why is this conspiracy a thing? The answer is, I don't actually know. The way Dr. Ballard says it is that the conspiracy started as mere gossip along the Irish coast in the 1940s and 50s. However, I'm not sure where he got the Irish gossip from, and if in fact it was started by gossip, that's all it was. The most likely reason is people do not understand why Lusitania's wreck is in such poor condition today, and they needed some kind of method to explain it, and the bombing theory made sense. However, the deterioration of the wreck is completely natural and also caused by some salvage efforts which did use explosives in the 1980s. A vital lesson that needs to be derived from this conspiracy is do not underestimate the wonders of the ocean. Comparing one shipwreck to another does not make sense if they are not residing in the same location. Most of the damage to Lusitania's wreck happened either the day of the sinking or just by currents, salt waters, and bacteria that the ship has been attacked by since it hit the seabed. With that having been said, I think I've hit the depth charge theory hard enough, so let's move on to the next conspiracy, which actually did not start out as a conspiracy, but over recent decades has developed into one, and this is the secondary explosion on the ship was ammunition or coal dust. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait a second, how does a legitimate theory turn into a conspiracy given time? Well, the reason it becomes a conspiracy is because it has been disproven since the theory was created, but it remains the main 2 points of discussion. It's effectively a method of retaliation against updated facts. So let's start with the ammunition first, since I find this one the easiest to disprove. In 2015, an expedition was carried out by Greg Bemis, whom owned Lusitania's wreck from 1968 until his death in 2019. The goal of this expedition was to prove, in his mind, that the ammunition had in fact caused a secondary explosion and was the sole reason Lusitania sunk. However, when he went down into cargo hold 2, which took some time to figure out how to get into there, he ended up finding that the ammunition was intact and in many respects still in boxes. Obviously, if you're looking at the ammunition and it is still stacked in boxes in many respects, it clearly couldn't have exploded. Now, if you're like Greg Bemis and not satisfied by seeing the ammunition as enough proof that it did not explode, let's go back to May 7th, 1915, during the time the secondary explosion happened, and disprove it that way. So let's take a look at what we know about the secondary explosion. According to eyewitnesses whom had seen it, the explosion ruptured out of funnel 1. As I'm sure most of you are well aware of, an explosion travels upwards, so if it is going out of funnel 1, the explosion had to originate from boiler room 1, and the ammunition is clearly not being stored in a boiler room. In fact, it is 2 bulkheads away from the boiler room. It's also worth mentioning now that these two bulkheads were sealed and watertight. Now, if the ammunition had exploded, there is a legitimate path that it would have traveled, and it would not be out of funnel 1, but rather cargo hatch number 2. Cargo hatch 2 is located just behind the foremast and in front of the wheelhouse, so quite a large distance from funnel 1 and is very difficult to mistaken. Now, if the explosion had in fact gone out of cargo hatch number 2, the hatch cover would be missing. However, the hatch is actually still with Lusitania in the main body of the wreck. It was not blasted off the ship. Okay, so now we're quite satisfied that it was not ammunition. What about the coal dust theory? This one actually seems to make pretty good sense. Now this is where Dr. Ballard begins adding information to the theory, since he's the one whom is actually responsible for the creation of the coal dust idea, because during his expedition to the wreck in 1993, he had noticed there was an abundance of coal laying on the seabed around Lusitania and slightly trailing from it. So in order to get an understanding as to how this theory is set up, I must discuss it first before disproving it. According to Dr. Ballard, the torpedo hits just at the after end of the forward coal bunker, basically where the watertight bulkhead separates the coal bunker from boiler room number 1. Due to the high humidity, coal dust laying around the nearly empty bunker as he claims, and the explosives of the torpedo, this creates a secondary explosion that is ignited by the dust. However, much like with the ammunition, the dust would ignite simultaneously with the torpedo and not half a minute later. Now, a common trait between the ammunition explosion and coal dust explosion is that it is supposed to sink the ship. Now, obviously, ammunition exploding most certainly has the force to damage the hull of the ship. However, this is not supported by the wreck in any way, but when it comes to the coal dust explosion, shortly after Greg Bemis did his expedition in 2015, he went to a scientific lab and tested the power of coal dust explosions, and though it creates an impressive light show, the force behind the explosion is not actually strong enough to damage the structure of the ship. So this here is also another reason as to why the secondary explosion in its own right is a conspiracy, because it actually does not hurt the ship in any way. The torpedo was the sole reason Lusitania was sunk, and the sole reason it was sunk in 18 minutes. But let's go back and directly disprove the coal dust explosion, much like using a method with the ammunition, and this would be the logical path of travel. Once again, we have a sealed watertight bulkhead separating the coal bunker from boiler room 1, and we have an entire boiler system blocking the passageway up to the funnel. So if the explosion has to go up and it's not very powerful, how does it get up into the boiler system through a bulkhead and then out of the funnel? Answer, it wouldn't. The only way that this explosion would have the ability to escape the coal bunker is if it blasted open the coal chutes. Now this means that the coal dust explosion would not actually travel out of funnel 1, but rather it would travel out of 2 different coal chutes on both the port and starboard sides, below the wheelhouse at the waterline. Now Lusitania was already listing 15 degrees to starboard by the time the secondary explosion occurs, so this means that the starboard side coal chutes were already submerged, so this means the explosion would only travel out the port side. So this begs the question, what was the secondary explosion? Well, we know it doesn't damage the structure of the ship, we know it wasn't ammunition, we know it wasn't coal dust. There are actually 2 logical explanations for this, though it's difficult to prove which one it exactly was, and this would be a boiler explosion or a steam pipe explosion, but to place them under one category that is more accurate, a thermal explosion. To simplify what a thermal explosion is in a circumstance like this, it is when the superheated, fully pressurized boilers are instantly contacted by significantly colder water. This immediate change in temperature does not react very well with the superheated steam, causing it to expand rapidly and burst the system that it is being contained in. This is backed up by events that happened after the secondary explosion, since the main propulsion engines and electrical generators lose steam pressure at rapid paces, meaning that obviously something went seriously wrong with the boiler system. But doesn't this mean that water has to get into the boiler room in order to cause this explosion? The answer is yes, and the torpedo is the reason the water gets in, as the location of cargo hold number 2 and the forward coal bunker hold no foundation for the torpedo impact point when there are survivors from the boiler rooms 1 and 2 whom actually give us the pinpoint location of the torpedo impact, and we also have the evidence of lifeboat number 5, which was knocked off by the wake of the torpedo. Based off the information that is supplied, it is possible to locate the torpedo's impact point at the mid to after end of Boiler Room 1. This puts it at a location to where it ruptures the hull in both Boiler Rooms 1 and 2, and also damages the watertight longitudinal bulkhead just beyond this that forms the coal bunkers. It also accounts for the wake hitting lifeboat number 5, since it needs to be kept in mind Lusitania was moving forward at 18 knots, so the torpedo impact is going to be slightly ahead of this lifeboat, which puts it right at the after end of Boiler Room 1. Combining all of this evidence together, it creates quite a crisp, clear picture as to what happened that fatal day. With that having been said, that is all I have to say on that conspiracy as well, and that is where I'm going to end the conspiracy video, since there are no more conspiracies that directly relate to the wreckage. So, if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day!